I remember rightly, Daddy's Little Princess was one of the first Cathy Glass books that I read. Started reading her books about 4 years ago, and I've decided now to start reading them in chronological order. And this is the third one chronologically, and what I consider to be the first one where Cathy Glass is really dealing with a potentially difficult situation. Most of her, well, I was going to say most of her most recent foster care memoirs, but just most of them in general focus on children either with difficult behaviours or who come from difficult or deprived situations. Because she did eventually become a specialist foster carer with years of experience dealing with those kinds of children. Obviously, in the very beginning, she was just looking after, I don't want to say your average foster child, but, a child who doesn't have any known specific needs. But Daddy's Little Princess is the first one chronologically where Cathy is faced with some deep water because she's fostering a little girl called Beth, who actually goes to the same school as Adrian. I think she's a year or two older than Adrian, but they go to the same school. And Beth comes to stay with Cathy because her father has had a mental breakdown. He has a history of mental health problems. He's had a breakdown. He's gone into hospital. That seems relatively straightforward, but Beth begins to display some behaviours that are atypical of a daughter interacting with her father. And Beth's teacher, Miss Willow, also raises concerns about this with Cathy, and somebody else does as well, and Cathy voices this to the people above her, and an investigation into this begins. And there are questions about whether or not Beth's father treats Beth more like an adult than a child. And I'm not going to say any more than that, but it certainly raises a lot of questions about how Beth is being treated. And it seems, from an outsider perspective, that her father treats her more like a partner than a daughter. And I don't want to spoil too much. I don't want to go into too much detail about what's actually going on, because obviously that's part of the fascination with these books and, the uncertainty about what each child is facing. But I will say it's not as bad as what we see in some of her other books. But it's still really fascinating, and if I kind of pussyfoot around this without explaining what it actually is, I will say that what is revealed is actually, a term is used, a specific piece of terminology is used to describe this situation, and I'd never come across that term. To be fair, I don't think I've come across it since then either. But it gave me food for thought, and it allowed me to think about the situation in a way I wouldn't have done. And if even just one person reading this book is able to identify a similar pattern of behaviour in other parents and children, it can definitely do a lot of good for encouraging people to get the right kind of help. What I love in this book is that there's no judgment. I feel like it's told from Cathy's perspective with no judgment about the people involved. She's very good at doing that. Obviously, there are certain memoirs where it's hard to not blame the parents because you can see just how much they've done a bad job of raising their children, and they've consciously made bad decisions that lead to neglect. But in this case, and in most of her memoirs, she takes more of a passive approach, because at the end of the day, as she often says, it's not her job to judge the parents, her job is to look after the child or the children. And I think the tone is really good. If you are reading this and you are in the same position as her father, I don't feel like you'd feel judged. I feel like you'd feel encouraged to speak out and get help. Which again, because I'm not really explaining what it's about, because I don't want to spoil it, I hope that makes sense. But what I'm trying to say is, it's eye-opening, and it can encourage people to identify certain patterns of behaviour, but if you do relate to this in either role, I think it's done very sensitively, and it is gripping, it is surprising. There were things in this that I had forgotten, because as I said, I think this was one of the first I read, so it's been about 4 years. There was a lot of it that I couldn't remember specifically, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not my absolute favourite, not that I know which one my favourite is. I might have to try and rank all of Cathy Glass's books at some point. But certainly for now, chronologically, it's the earliest, most gripping memoir. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. If you're a fan of Cathy Glass's books and you haven't read Daddy's Little Princess, I think you'll love it. It's also worth pointing out that we also get to find out more about Cathy's relationship with her husband. I won't say any more than that, but if you are familiar with her books that are set later than this, you'll be aware of what I'm talking about. But we do get more of an insight into Cathy's life, and how she feels as a person about things in her life outside of fostering, which doesn't crop up that frequently in some of her memoirs, so it's always refreshing when we get to know more about the person behind the words. But I really enjoyed it. If you haven't read it and you like this kind of book, I think Daddy's Little Princess is definitely really strong.